Hey there guys, so I'm really excited about this. I love watercolors, they can be so much fun, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to some easy watercolor techniques which you can apply in different pieces of art that we'll make this year. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start out by tracing 6 circles or squares onto our visual journal or into our visual journal. We're going to do 3 on each side. So I'll show you what that looks like. I am going to leave some space between them so that I have room to write some information about what I did. So here we go. I'm just going to find something round and I'm going to trace 3 circles. Okay, so now would be a good time for you to gather the rest of the materials you're going to need for this project. So I'm going to go over what they are. You'll need a pencil. You are going to need markers, several colors, rice, if you have it and you're permitted to use it, please get permission first. You don't need a lot, even like a teaspoon would be fine. A little piece of plastic wrap or any type of thin plastic like a Ziploc bag that you could put on top. Salt, again, get permission. This is just regular table salt. A quarter of a teaspoon, half a teaspoon would be fine. You are going to need a clean tissue or napkin, water, and a paintbrush container to hold that in. And I think that's just about everything you're gonna need for this project. Okay, go grab those things and come back and join me. Okay, so I'm gonna start with our first technique and we're gonna use salt. So I'm just gonna label this salt and then you're gonna follow along with me. Oh, I forgot, you need watercolors. Make sure you grab your watercolors because we're doing watercolor techniques. Okay, so I've got my watercolors right here and I am going to activate my paints, which we know just means I'm putting a drop of water onto the paints I want to use. And I'm just gonna go with purple for this. I think this technique works better with dark colors. So we're going to paint this in. Okay, this does absolutely have to be wet for this to work. So you're going to work pretty quickly. You're then going to take your salt. You are just going to sprinkle that on top of there. You can already see it's starting to have an effect. And we're just gonna let that dry. Okay, so we're not gonna do anything else to that. If it's dry by the end of the video, we'll come back and take a look at what it looks like. If not, what you're gonna do is you're gonna wait for that area to dry completely. So at least a good hour, maybe longer. And then once it's dry, and you're 100% sure it's dry, you'll wipe the salt off to see the effect that's been created. Okay, so we're gonna do another similar one. I'm going to use blue for this one. I do think that the salt and the rice technique, which I'm about to use, work better with darker colors. I don't think they work as well when you use a color like yellow. So I will say the darker the color, I think the better the rice and the salt work. And again, both of these have to be wet. The paint has to be wet in order for this to work. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab my salt or my rice and I am just going to put that right on top. And again, just like with the salt, I'm going to let that sit. I'm not going to move it around. I'm just going to let it dry. Okay, so you can see you don't need a ton of rice for this. Okay, so we're just going to label this rice. can go in and fancy this up if you want. Draw some arrows. Okay. And the next one we're going to do is going to be what's called wet on wet. So for this one, we're going to start with a clean brush and we're going to paint this circle in with water. And you'll know that the paper is wet because it will be a bit shiny. It will look a bit different than the other spaces. So I'm just painting this in with water and doing a wet on wet technique, okay? So let's see what this looks like. Just trying to pick my colors I want to use. So you'll see what are called blooms starting to happen. There are different ways of doing wet on wet. I'm just showing you what I'm feeling like doing right now. Okay, so I'm just putting some spots on there. You can try a different color if you want. You don't have to use red. Let's stick with analogous colors. That means colors that are beside each other on the color wheel. So we just did color theory recently. So colors that are beside each other on the color wheel are analogous. I'm going to stick with analogous colors here. Okay, and I'm just going to let that do its thing. So this is just called wet on wet. So what that means is we have number one, wet paper. 2, put on wet paint. Okay. So then we're going to come over here and we're going to do a couple more techniques. Be careful with the wet on wet. If it's too wet, it can get pretty messy. So the next one we're going to do is a plastic wrap technique. So maybe I'll do blue and green this time. I haven't used green at all yet. So I'm just going to paint on colors that I know are going to play nicely together here. So again, using my knowledge of color theory, thinking about colors on the color wheel, colors that are used together. So as I like to say, colors that will play nicely with each other. For this, it is okay if your colors are wet and touching each other. But obviously when that happens, you do get bleeds, which means your colors are going to start running together. And for this technique, that is 100% fine. That's why I'm always saying let your colors dry before you paint next to them, because most of the time we don't want our colors running together. For this technique, it's perfectly fine though. Okay, so what I'm going to do now that I've painted this in, I am going to take some plastic wrap, kind of just bunch it up a little bit, and I only want it going on top of this one circle. So I'm just going to press down like so. And I'm going to let this dry for a long time, okay? So I'm not going to lift it up or do anything with it. It's going to stay like that. For a lot of these techniques, they have to dry for a while before we can do anything else to them. So this is our plastic wrap. It's important to document what you're doing in your journals, because sometimes we forget what something was that we did. Okay, or maybe in a couple years, I know you're thinking, no way, Mrs. Hunt, but in a couple years, maybe you're in high school and you have a project to do and you remember, you know what, we learned these really cool watercolor techniques when I was in like 6th grade. Let me go back to my journal and see what those were. Or maybe even in 8th grade art class. Okay, next we have one more, pretty simple one. I'm gonna mix some colors on here. I have a tendency to use cool colors more than warm colors. Again, you can use any color you want for this. I do think, again, the darker the color, the better some of these effects work. That's really your choice. I'm gonna work some purple into here. And again, for this technique, it's okay if your colors run together. Not a big deal, as long as you're okay with them running together. If you don't want them running together, you better wait for them to dry. Okay, and then what I can do is with the tissue, I can just go in, lift out colors from various areas, just randomly. Make sure you don't do the whole thing because then you'll lose all of your color. So pick just a few areas, down and straight up. So we're just lifting off some of that color. Okay, so that's just a tissue lift. And then our last one is actually not using watercolors, but they're gonna turn into something similar to watercolors. So this is actually marker. So again, think about your knowledge of color theory. It's so important. That's why it's almost always one of our first lessons in the year. I'm gonna start with red. I'll just scribble it on there. And purple. All right, now what I'm gonna do is I am going to start with a wet brush. And I'm just gonna paint that together. These do have to be water-based markers, washable markers. This would not work with a Sharpie or any other permanent markers. I'm rinsing my brush when I switch colors. I'm going into the yellow. I'm not dragging it too much into the green yet. Rinsing my brush again. Now I'm going to go into my green. And I'm pulling more down with the green than I am up, just because it gets a little bit brown or muddy when it gets mixed with the orange. Okay. Rinsing my brush again. Going into my blue and my purple. Okay, so you're gonna let those sit for a while, and then what you're going to do is you'll come back and check in on them. to see what they look like in, I don't know, an hour, maybe 2 hours. Really fully let them dry. The one that usually takes the longest to dry, the salt and the saran wrap usually take the longest. We're gonna let this dry. Before we do, we're gonna label it. So we'll go ahead and see what happens with that, okay? All right, I hope you have fun, and what you're gonna be doing next is selecting, once these are all dry and you've decided what you really like, one of these to create the background for your All About Me collage. So I look forward to seeing what you come up with and which technique you prefer. Okay, so here we are about 3.5 hours later. I just rubbed the salt gently off of this with a tissue and the rice and lifted off the plastic or saran wrap from this one. So I'm gonna let you look at these a little bit closer. So we have the salt effect here. We can see the rice one is a very minimal effect, but it's still interesting how it creates those little lines and a little bit of texture where the rice was sitting. So you can see where each grain of rice was actually sitting on the paper. We see the final wet on wet. The saran wrap works out pretty cool. Our tissue lift looks pretty much the same as it did to begin with. And then even our marker and water definitely changed over time. So I just wanted to show you what the final pieces look like and encourage you to make sure that you give everything enough dry time. All right.